Greetings world, and welcome to the patriarchical state. I really like how Wikipedia has reformulated Sylvia Warby's claims about the patriarchal state. So it says, the state, women are unlikely to have formal power and representation. So obviously, in her presentation of her material, she attempts to infer that there's a quantification of power that can be made. I think it's quite impossible to really quantify it in a mathematical sense. Something I would also like to argue is that her claims is really it consists of a bad understanding of democracy, basically. So what I'm going to do now is going to be a bit hard to follow. I hope you can follow it. So I'm going to juxtapose forms of representation in democracy with her claims that women are unlikely to be represented. So here we see in Denmark, as an example, we see forms of representation in democracy. This is kind of a social science basic know-how, I would argue. So one way that women can be represented in a democratic process is through voting rights at elections, which women were granted in 1915. Subsequently, they could also be candidates in elections. Before that, there were grassroots activism, NGOs, protests, etc. And there were also debates in the media, most notably newspapers, in which women could influence a lot of policy. So when Sylvia Warby on women's representation writes, and I quote, "Women are relatively excluded from a direct presence in the state and do not have as much power to bring to bear on the resolutions of issues in their favor." It's basically not really true. They have every possible way of doing it, just like men do. So we can just see through this juxtaposition that Warby only recognizes candidacy in elections, which is true they didn't have before 1918. They have it now, so there's not really any discrimination against women on that level, at least. So it really consists of a poor conception of what democracy is and how you act in the democratic process. So you can easily cherry pick and perceive some injustices that are not really there. Of course, my objections to these things, apart from what I already did, is that men in power do not favor other men, as is often referred, is often inferred by feminists, and women are actually more represented in the democratic process, I would argue. And I would like to elaborate on these claims right now. So, in women's favor, women do not have as much power to bring to bear on the resolutions of issues in their favor. So, men favor women? Do men favor men? Basically, she says that genders act in their own favor. And we can see from Eva Fix, we have a quote here: "The world was created by man, not by men, and women jointly for common ends, not by women, but by men." Of course, for their own ends. This really backs up my claim that women see that men favor themselves and not women. Which, again, if we look at what rights they have, it's not really that true, is it? So we have this study, very interesting study, done by two women, in which these two women, they argue that men and women are actually both biased in favor of women. As they say, why women like women more than men like men? We could just presume from that there's a pro-woman bias. Amy Young, she says that society discourages pro-male bias. Whenever men try to stick up for themselves, it's seen as hostile sexism towards women, is basically what's in this study. So basically we can just kind of infer from this that we really live in a gynocentric, as the people on the internet call it now, a gynocentric culture, that women have sort of a proxy power because women are preferred in society. Of course, this doesn't mean that women are not abused, you would say. Of course they are, but the abuse towards men is being neglected. So as for women in power, now we get to it. We see in Denmark they are actually very, very close to half. Very close to half of actually being in power. As in the United States, they're only 20%. So you could say, well, maybe there's some kind of problem. This is really debatable. Let's see how the women vote now. Well, it's actually majority of women. There are more women represented in the Danish process compared to the men. So women are really more represented here than men are. In the United States, it's the same. I've made a diagram here, and it says that women are almost 52%. That's actually a lot. So women are more represented here. And in NGOs, well, there's a large amount of feminist NGOs. We can just look at the Wikipedia page. As for men's NGOs, a very quite small amount of them in comparison. We see that the Danish Women's Society, I think that's what they call it in English, they consult the government. We can see it under their page here. There's a link given in Danish. You can translate it to English if you so prefer. So basically almost only women are represented here in NGOs as well. And now we get to power distribution. More men are both in the top and in the bottom of society. So the idea that men are sort of on top and women are in the bottom, that's not correct. Women are in the middle. Men are on the top and on the bottom. 78% of the homeless in Denmark are men. 63.7% are men in the United States. So a majority in both. So what can we really conclude from this? As for power in the state, there are fewer women in power, that is true. But there are more female representation by men. So men act on behalf of women. Just like you would expect. Exactly, you would expect that everyone in power acts on behalf of everyone. But you could assume by the feminist power that they're actually more represented than men because of the amount of NGOs. Powerless men are neglected. There are more female voters. So it's really hard to conclude that women are oppressed. In the next part, we will examine men's status and women's status within the household. That's in the next part. Thanks for now.